Okay, I think we're almost ready to begin here. You're ready for the pop quiz, I hope, all of you, right? All set. After 5 weeks of this, you should be able to distinguish between Sunni and Shia, the Ottoman influence over the Byzantine, all of these sorts of things that you know from us. Okay. I want to thank all of you for coming out on what is clearly I think I've managed to bring the rain in both of my talks. It was a miserable day. I want to thank once again Bill Longwell for providing such a basis that I can skip around a little bit today, as you'll see. And I want to thank Sam McSeveny for certainly getting me into this, and also want to thank Norma for setting this up as well. I hope if you've enjoyed or appreciated that you'll say something to them. You get a chance. I hope you did your homework this past week, followed all the references to the Middle East in the news. It was pretty prominent on a couple of occasions. One was the Republican debate, where the candidates sort of vied with each other about bombing Iran or setting back the Iranian nuclear program in whatever ways they were talking about. But that issue came up, as did the issue of Israel. The foreign policy debate certainly highlighted it. If nothing else, one of the, and I'll start here, is one of the issues or one of the things you learn from following American politics in the Middle East is that presidents usually only have a fairly narrow window of time in which to do anything in the Middle East before election concerns really prevent any real tackling of the issue. That, in this sense, Israel and its situation in the situation of Israel in American politics is such as to really prevent action over a longer haul, that it's simply much too much an important political issue. I want to briefly summarize sort of what I did last week and also make an initial disclaimer. I'm not going to cover everything I wanted to. I'm going to try to make up for the lack of coverage with a couple of big themes. And I'm going to do that in part in the same way that I sometimes work with my undergraduates, which is providing sort of video approach. Last week I used the news and the imagery of the Nasser funeral, and I'm going to try to do something of that today to give you some sense of the themes as I want to cover American policy from what I hope to be covering from about the Yom Kippur War up till as much as I can to the present day. Simply to remind you of something I said last week, that one of the challenges of talking about history is that it is both lived forward and, as C.V. Wedgwood said, both lived forwards but written in retrospect. We know the end before we consider the beginning. We can never wholly recapture what it was like to know the beginning only. It's interesting on the Middle East that at times people have thought they knew what the end was going to be. In the 1990s, PBS, for example, commissioned a documentary called The 50 Years' War, thinking that as a result of Oslo and the peace process, that the Middle East was going to be settled and that you would have an answer. So in effect, one of the things we learned is the issue or the problem of premature optimism, which has certainly been an issue for many when we talk about the Middle East. And I'll get to that a little bit today. To remind you, I did talk about the sort of three pillars of American policy: the Cold War, support for Israel, and the issue of oil, all of them having a real significance, and only one of them really gets removed in 1989 to 1991. And the other two still are awfully important for understanding the period. Talked a little bit about the early stages of U.S. policies in the Middle East with Saudi Arabia, the beginnings of the Cold War and containment, Truman's decision to recognize Israel, the partition plans, Americans' involvement early on in Iran, the role of the United States actually in encouraging restitution to Israel from Germany, and European powers' particular importance in sustaining Israel in the first 20 years or so of its existence compared even to the United States. Talked a bit about the Suez Crisis and the Cold War, Nasser and Khrushchev, the key figures. The Eisenhower Doctrine is the first major appearance of the United States in the Middle East, and made the point that in effect the United States comes in the Middle East on the heels of the failure of European powers and their withdrawal, particularly of Britain, as it moves back from its point and stance as the key power in the region. The Democrats with John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson brought a closer relationship with Israel, even as they tried to deal with Nasser and Egypt. The Six-Day War was a huge event in this category. The success of Israel underlining its power and significance to many Americans, even as they sought still to settle the issue, the admiration for Israel as an ally, having defeated a Soviet-backed ally in the midst of what was America's most frustrating years, bogged down in Vietnam, gave Israel a certain greater significance, I think, than might have been the case otherwise. Nixon and Kissinger sought an arrangement in the Middle East in the midst of rising fears that had developed both about the stability of the region and then, of course, as terrorism became a common, a familiar word to Americans particularly after the Olympics massacre. Iran became a key American ally in the Middle East, able to use its checkbook as oil revenues rose to buy any American weapons systems and to pursue its own development, support for the Shah as our proxy, our policeman in the Middle East. And finally, I ended last time with talking a bit about the Yom Kippur War, which shook the Middle East as well and also brought the United States and the Soviet Union for a time to a point of crisis as they, in the midst of Watergate, the United States went on a nuclear alert to deal with what it perceived as the possibility of Soviet intervention in the Middle East. The Middle East in the 70s became the forefront of American diplomacy, and it shaped Henry Kissinger's reputation as a celebrity diplomat, as he coined the term shuttle diplomacy, negotiating within the region various withdrawal agreements between Egypt and Israel and Syria and Israel. The United States became the key power broker over the Middle Eastern peace process. This didn't mean that there wasn't a continuing sympathy, I think, for Israel, something some Americans might remember as the Entebbe hijacking, which became a movie when Palestinian hijackers took an Israeli plane to Uganda, and the Israelis launched a mission to free their hostages. It quickly became an American movie, again, a heroic picture of Israel. Netanyahu's brother actually was the commander of the Israeli task force that went in, and he was killed in that. The current prime minister's brother was killed in that successful freeing of the hostages. I want to start today, actually, though, with this. I want to start with one of those moments in the Middle East that actually encouraged an enormous degree of hope. This picture captures something of it, but I brought along the chronicle of the event by ABC News. It's a little too lengthy for me to play the entire thing, but I thought I'd play just a bit for you to get the flavor of this moment. It was a moment in history that many Americans never thought they'd see, an Egyptian leader going to Jerusalem to present his case to the Israeli Knesset.
Israel. Today, after an extraordinary 44 hours, Egypt's President Sadat returned to his home and a hero's welcome. He left behind a tired but happy Israeli Prime Minister. Here is how the day went in chronological order. First, Bill Siemens.
The last day of the unbelievable visit began at the Knesset, where he had spoken yesterday, and today President Sadat met all the political factions. They sat down and talked frankly and freely in the kind of extraordinary dialogue that President Sadat said was needed to open the way to peace. Here, President Sadat Sadat focused on two main issues: full security for Israel and no more war. He said the October 1973 war is the last forever. And then this exchange with former Prime Minister Golda Meir.
So that even an old lady like I am will live to see the day. You always call me an old lady, Mr. President. We will live to see the day. Whoever stands on the part of Israel, I want to live to see that day of peace between you and us, of peace between all our neighbors and us. And Mr. President, as a grandmother to a grandfather, may I give you a little present for the new granddaughter. And thank you for your present that you have given us.
The no-war promise was then taken up by Prime Minister Begin when they went to the Jerusalem theater to face over 700 newsmen from around the world.
I said, let us give a silent oath one to another. No more war, no more bloodshed, no more threats. May I say that that mutual pledge was given in Jerusalem.
Both sides stepped the question of when Mr. Begin would go to Cairo. Sadat said they had agreed to postpone the invitation, indicating that more political and psychological preparation was needed. Both repeated positions they took in yesterday's speeches, and again there was no mention of the PLO. Then a visit to the home of President Iran-Contra, Israel's head of state, where President Sadat received a gift of pottery dating from the time of Abraham, the common forefather of both Jew and Arab. And the last scene in Israel on this historic day, at the airport, where Sadat thanked the leaders of the Jewish state. The honor guard was again reviewed, and the 21-gun salute mixed with the music of the national anthems. Sadat said goodbye to, as he put it, my friend, Premier Begin. The last salute came from Kafir fighters, made in Israel, and first used against Egypt in the Yom Kippur War. Bill Siemens, ABC News in Israel.
I'm Peter Jennings in Cairo. Mr. Reagan and President Sadat throughout this trip had avoided any direct challenge to each other. But there was one moment during the news conference in Jerusalem today when President Sadat made it pretty clear what he expected from the Israelis. There is a need, he said now, for hard and drastic decisions. He went on, I took my share in coming here. That was, many observers thought, his way of saying to the Israelis, I need something in return. Shortly thereafter, without any precise commitment to do anything except keep dialogue alive, President Sadat was on his way home. As we took off from Vanderbilt Airport, the President glanced out the window to see an escort of friendly Israeli jet fighters. A unique and frankly startling guard of honor indeed. ABC's Frank Reynolds was here in Cairo when President Sadat arrived. As Anwar Sadat entered Egyptian airspace, he was escorted home by a flight of his jets. The welcoming ceremonies at the Cairo airport were brief and relatively restrained. Members of his government and the diplomatic corps were there to greet him. It was not until the motorcade left the airport and began to move through the streets of this teeming city that the depth of his countrymen's feelings became evident. And it is correct to say, the extent of his courage. For here, knowing full well that some other Arab leaders have branded him a traitor to the Arab cause, and not knowing who might be waiting for him in this huge crowd, Anwar Sadat chose to ride in an open car. Usually, the drive from the airport to the presidential residence takes no more than half an hour. Tonight, the journey required 90 minutes. Sadat has ridden in parades before, but this one was different. From millions of throats there came the cry, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. God is great, God is great. Now, Anwar Sadat is resting in his home just across the Nile. His massive welcome here an answer to his critics elsewhere. And something else, proof of just how anxious these suffering people have been to hear their leader join with the Israelis in saying those three tremendous words, no more war. This is Frank Reynolds.
Hopefully that conveyed, I think, something of 34 years ago, And as you could see, the date, November 21st, 1977, 34 years ago, people thought there had been this enormous breakthrough. And Sadat's visit was hugely and warmly received. You could tell from the coverage of the American reporters themselves the sense of what a triumph this was for him to have done this. And of course, it didn't immediately yield peace, but over the next several months, it changed really the focus and agenda of the Carter administration's presidency. Jimmy Carter did not come into office necessarily with a plan to deal with the Middle East. But Sadat, in many ways, forced his hand and sort of compelled him, as he would ultimately, to get involved in the nitty-gritty of Middle East peacemaking. Over the next several months, there would be a number of false starts, an attempt first to do a four-power talks at Geneva, which failed, more terrorist attacks and other attacks that seemed to indicate that things were still tense. Sadat's isolation in the Arab world, you could already tell from the commentary the sense that Sadat faced great danger if he couldn't deliver on the promise that he had made. Well, in September of 1978, President Carter invites both Sadat and Menachem Begin. And as you might recall from Bill's lectures, Menachem Begin represented the right wing in Israeli politics, much more militant. Begin himself having been, in effect, a terrorist during the Israeli war against the British. Over a period of more than 2 weeks, in intense conversations in which talks almost broke down several times, Jimmy Carter gets this, sort of a ceremony, a sense of achievement at Camp David. What is accomplished at Camp David? The principal result of Camp David was the withdrawal of the Israelis from the Sinai, to be accomplished over a period of some 4 years from the territory that they had conquered from Egypt. It would be policed both by the United Nations, but much more importantly by the United States. It was an American commitment to actually be a part of peacekeeping in the region. Other assurances of Camp David were, for example, diplomatic and economic relations between the two, free passage through international waterways, what had been a source of conflict before. Israel could also buy oil from the Sinai wells that it had begun to drill during the time it occupied the territory. And most importantly, and something which has continued up to the present day, the United States would financially underwrite both countries with aid in a scale of almost $5 billion per year, divided between Israel and Egypt. In effect, the United States, both politically, militarily, and economically, underwrote the Camp David Accords. There were problems, though. Camp David obviously left many things unresolved. What would be the transitional periods, how they would develop for the West Bank and Gaza? What would be the type of promise for the Palestinian self-rule that had been accorded? Many key concepts were not defined. For example, Camp David called for the legitimate security concerns of Israel to be assured and the legitimate rights of the Palestinians to be assured. Jerusalem was not resolved. The PLO was not recognized. The result was, of course, that the Arab world rejected Camp David. Sadat's isolation only intensified and would remain ultimately until his assassination some 3 years later, although in many respects that was only one of the issues in which he was killed for. My point here is to emphasize something, and I'll come back to this as I talk about the next issue, is that the United States came to rely for its own interests and for peace in the Middle East on an Egyptian autocrat. The image you saw of Anwar Sadat was a very positive one, laughing with Golda Meir, the avuncular uncle almost figure, grandfather figure. And Sadat came to enjoy enormous admiration in the United States, so much so that after his assassination, President Reagan would dispatch 3 American presidents, an unprecedented honor in many respects, to attend his funeral. Nixon, Ford, and Carter all attended the funeral of Anwar Sadat. But it was, in effect, a bargain, a devil's bargain, with autocracy in Egypt guaranteeing a peace that was not ultimately one that would be as fully shared in the sentiments of the Egyptian people. Now, you saw in the video that the Egyptian people, at least initially, welcomed Sadat primarily for the appeal of ending the warfare, the situation of warfare. But over time, Egypt did not benefit as fully as many came to expect. Its economic development and its benefits from Camp David did not seem to many in Egypt to have been as extensive as they hoped it would be, and also Sadat as an autocrat, and then later Mubarak as an autocrat, also were able to have a system that benefited many of their own cronies as well as the Egyptian military, much more than anyone else in the system. So the bargain with autocracy in Egypt faced that challenge. At the same time, and you have to keep in mind this 34 years ago dealing with this, just about 34 years ago, we were also dealing with another issue in the Middle East. And it's, in some senses, the simultaneity and the fact that these still exist is part of the theme I hope to bring today. This is not a newscast, although it could have been and probably was partly excerpted. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to do some research at the Carter Library. And I decided I needed to bring this back to show my students. So this is a videotape that was provided sort of courtesy of the Carter Library. And I'll play you a part of it. We have no volume? Well. I'm not sure how I lost the volume on that. Any ideas on that one? Had it just a second ago. Some of you may recognize this. This is, of course, the famous Christmas, New Year's Eve visit of Jimmy Carter to the Shah of Iran. I would hesitate to try and imitate Carter. I can do a reasonably good Henry Kissinger, but despite 20 years in the South, I am not very good with Carter. Did we lose it? Okay. Well, I guess we're probably not going to get this, although, as I say, technology can sometimes fail you. I wanted to play it because of its extravagant praise that President Carter lavished on the Shah, his discussion of the importance of the Shah as an island of stability in a sea of turmoil, his attempt in a very subtle, not so subtle way to talk about the importance of human rights to both countries, which was, as I say, subtle and not subtle, because human rights was, of course, an issue with the Shah's regime. Carter also spent time talking about how much the Iranian people loved the Shah, what the Shah had done for them. And it was part of a sort of effort to in a sense, kill the Shah with kindness at this point, since the United States was also asking for him to make some reforms. Carter also mentions in this toast the thousands and thousands of Americans in Iran. Some 30,000 Americans involved in economic, military projects who came out to see his motorcade and to be there, and how this testified to the enormous bonds of friendship between the two countries. I think we could probably stop. I'm not going to be able to do it, so thanks. I'll just stop the tape and go back to the computer. Thanks. It just somehow decided not to go. So,
What year was that?
this was literally 2 months after what you saw with the Sadat tape, namely January of 1978, so about 34 years ago. These two things went on in a degree of simultaneous events, namely the United States was pursuing Camp David and the attempt at bringing some type of accord between Israelis and Palestinians at the same time as Iran would slowly, initially, and then suddenly burst into turmoil. And over the course of 1978, in fact, as Carter was at Camp David, several of the incidents took place with demonstrations. A movie theater had burned down, and the demonstrations, the funerals that led to more demonstrations, the continuing turmoil in Iran. And the administration, focused as it was on the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli question, provided much less attention at this initially until later. And then toward the end of the year, the question came up, what should the United States do about Iran? It decided, in effect, to encourage the Shah to leave and to try to plan a political transition to moderate members of his cabinet and to the military that would collapse. And the man who would come back would be Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in Paris during much of '78. I'm still convinced that there are probably some very interesting French historical documents about what their game was in 1978 with Ayatollah Khomeini and the fact that he was able, in effect, to lead the exile movement from Paris during this time. But Khomeini, of course, returns in '79, and very quickly the political situation of Iran is transformed. The United States loses what had been its most central military base and situation in the region. Israel loses a country that had been a de facto ally, providing it oil. The United States' fears during this time about Iran actually also centered around the fear of a possible Soviet influence, but the general sense that the United States had lost a significant regional position was strong. And in effect, the attempt to pin American interests around an autocrat in Iran came to a tremendous disaster. This, of course, a few months later was the hostage crisis, which would, in effect, both be Jimmy Carter's initial salvation, as it provided him politically with the opportunity to be the commander-in-chief for a time and to defeat the primary challenge launched by Ted Kennedy. I often point out to my students that in October of 1979, the month before the hostage crisis, 2/3 of Democrats preferred Kennedy to Carter as their nominee. Within a month and a half after that, Carter would be the clear choice, and he would defeat Kennedy in a primary campaign over the next several months. Among the hostage takers, these men, which the United States has conveniently decided is not Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. It may very well have been him, but we can't have any type of dealings. He certainly could never have come to the United States, even in the role that he did as to speak to the UN if we had actually identified him as one of these. But there continues to be some feeling that he may have, in fact, been among the hostage takers. Again, it's sometimes hard to recall, but one reason why the sense of crisis became so pervasive about the region was that only a month after the hostage crisis, the Soviet Union decides to invade Afghanistan. The Soviet decision in Afghanistan is a fascinating one to study. I could spend many hours talking to you about it because, in part, the collapse of the Soviet Union has allowed us to see many of the documents and the materials which led Soviet leaders to intervene. What's fascinating about them is how much of this had to do with something Americans had only recently talked about, namely their credibility. The Soviets believed their credibility was on the line in Afghanistan. If that government was overthrown, if the Mujahideen, the early Mujahideen, had defeated the communist-imposed government in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union feared a domino effect that would not only unhinge its alliances with other states, but even stretch into the Soviet Union's Muslim states in Central Asia. And in effect, in a moment of thinking that they could, through a quick use of military forces they had in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, that they could put down the rebellion in Afghanistan, they decide in December of '79 to go in to Afghanistan. The result is, of course, a much longer commitment. The United States boycotts the Olympics, puts a grain embargo, but the hostage crisis continued until in April of 1980, Jimmy Carter attempts or launches an attempted military rescue. I used to tell my students that I thought that his chances for re-election died in the desert in Iran when this crisis took place. I'm not so sure anymore. I actually think the economy plays a far more significant role in most elections than foreign policy, but it didn't help, to put it mildly, that the United States was seen as weak and feckless militarily, unable to rescue its hostages, and the result was, of course, the hostage crisis would stretch on all the way until January 20th, 1981. In the middle or after, of course, even a war between Iran and Iraq would break out in September of 1980, but you would get the election of Ronald Reagan. And Reagan's coming to the White House at this time would bring, I think, an important change for a time in American approaches to the Middle East. Not as fundamental as some would later argue, but Jimmy Carter had hoped and had come into the White House in part with the idea of refocusing American foreign policy away from its obsession with the Cold War toward the resolution of regional disputes such as in the Middle East and elsewhere. He had hoped, in a sense, to put human rights as the priority of American foreign policy over anti-communism. Reagan reverses that. Reagan comes in with a very stout and determined anti-communism that sees the Soviet Union as essentially behind most of the unrest in the world and sees the United States' principal objective as trying to roll back Soviet power. And Reagan's obsession with the Cold War would influence, in some ways, his decisions on the Middle East, although in some ways it also shows that that was an inadequate way for looking at the region. Not long, of course, after Reagan comes into power, Sadat is assassinated. The Islamic Jihad, groups that kill him. Initially, there's the perception that perhaps Egypt might be lost as an ally of the United States, but very quickly, Hosni Mubarak and the military consolidate power and continue the peace settlement and the negotiations, and in fact, Camp David continues. What does happen, though, in the early 80s is an Israeli determination, in some sense, to undertake its own solution to various problems, and in particular, the problem of the PLO and the Palestinian leadership. And in one of the more fateful decisions ever taken by an Israeli prime minister, in June of 1982, Israel invades Lebanon, with the prime objective being the destruction of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. What does happen as a result of the Israeli invasion, though, is in many respects a beginning of a souring of, to some extent, of the US-Israeli relationship. Even though Ronald Reagan had been a stout admirer of Israel, even he is compelled now to urge Israeli restraint. And in effect, especially after the Sabra Shatila massacre carried out by some Israeli allies among the Christian militia in Beirut, the United States is in a position where it decides it has to take, again, a more forward position. And American forces are sent into Lebanon in a peacekeeping operation. Reagan justifies this not solely as a measure on Middle Eastern peace, he also justifies it in terms of Soviet influence in the region, particularly in Syria. But in fact, he puts the United States military in the middle of a civil war in Lebanon. And in many respects, the American involvement in Lebanon has eerie parallels with our subsequent role, at least for a time, in Iraq. Different, but similar in many respects, particularly the first case of suicide bombing against American interests of the sort, where the suicide bomber destroys the Marine barracks in October of 1983. If I had more time, and if the darn volume was working, I could show you some of the coverage from that. Because one of the things you're struck by is what Reagan argues when justifying is the United States has to keep its commitments. It has to stay in the region, and one of the justifications is Syria and the perception of Soviet influence in the region. But rather soon after this incident, the United States redeploys its forces offshore. It gets out of Lebanon. It withdraws. We don't have the full documentation on the reasons for that withdrawal. Some would suggest that the Lebanese issue could have become a political football in 1984 that could have damaged the Reagan attempt at re-election, and that in effect there was not the popular commitment or support for staying in the region. Some of you may know that subsequently it has been alleged, and I think probably with reasonable, I was going to say reasonable certainty, but it's been alleged that Osama bin Laden, in making the case for the September 11th attacks, argued that Americans would not respond, as they had not responded, for example, to the Marine bombing, that they would in effect be proven out to be unwilling to take any additional casualties, that they would not respond militarily as they had continually been attacked subsequent. The United States' role in Middle Eastern peace negotiations in the 80s was fairly limited. Hijacking became an issue again throughout the 80s. This is a famous incident, the TWA hijacking in 85, the Achille Lauro at the same time, the ship in the Mediterranean. The United States, in a sense, focused its anti-terrorism activities against Gaddafi in Libya during this time as the key proponent of that, and undertook a military mission against him in April of 1986. That may or may not have, of course, had much effect. It probably led Gaddafi to the bombing, the Lockerbie bombing of a couple of years later. Reagan's Middle Eastern policy blew up for a time, in particular in the Iran-Contra affair. Even now, looking back on it, it's often hard to explain this to students. You mean the United States was selling weapons to Iran to get funds to give to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, at the same time it was hoping to get the release of hostages in the Middle East? Yes, that's what we were trying to do. There was a design there that thought, in part, it rested on a belief that Iran's larger interests, the interests that had led Iran, the anti-Arab, the desire for a relationship with the United States, would be overcome. And in fact, some of those in the Reagan years thought that going to Iran would be similar to Nixon going to China, that they could, in effect, get over the revolutionary hostility of the Iranians by these weapons deals, and that this would be a way to pacify the Middle East and restore Iran's role as a more constructive power. And the Israelis, at times, encouraged that view. The other view, of course, was also to get away from the congressional restrictions on funding for the Contras, and it almost got Reagan impeached. And it probably, in technical terms, could have, because he probably not only knew of it, but was condoning the policy. But the American people did not really have a desire to see another failed presidency. In the 80s, one of the central things the United States did do was, of course, aid the Mujahideen. Charlie Wilson's War, which some of you probably seen, sort of gives this a sort of a Hollywood glaze. But certainly the American efforts during this period to support the insurgency, to give the Russians what some in the White House called their Vietnam, to in effect weaken and undermine them through aiding the Islamic rebels, was a strong a policy of the Reagan period. It involved all sorts of alliances with unsavory characters, some of which we know of course, to this day, but also it involved a very close relationship with Pakistan, which was cultured or cultivated during this time as well. Ultimately, it was successful, of course, in forcing a Soviet withdrawal. The absence of any movement, though, in the Arab-Israeli conflict, the absence of any real progress in implementing the provisions of the Camp David Accord did lead to the First Intifada, which stretched on for almost 4 years in the Palestinian territories against Israeli occupation. As with Lebanon, the images, and again, the TV archive at Vanderbilt is quite rich in this manner, the images of the Israelis initially putting down the rebellion forcefully, the images of Yitzhak Rabin, who would later be a hero of the peace movement, saying that you needed to break bones of the Palestinians, was a difficult image for supporters of Israel in the United States. It made it more difficult to argue the Israeli position. And the Intifada of the time weakened for a time, or at least encouraged the notion that the United States should become more active in peacekeeping. It also led, at the same time, to the rise of Hamas, as the religious-oriented resistance, particularly in Gaza, came to have leadership of the movement. One thing that did happen as a result, though, of the Intifada in part, was finally the United States coming to a recognition of the Palestine Liberation Organization and to getting Yasser Arafat, at least formally, to renounce terrorism. And so as the Cold War was coming to an end in 1989, with the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan and the arms control agreements between Reagan and Gorbachev, there was a sense that the peace process could be pushed forward. And in fact, in the first year and a half of the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, there was a conscious effort to try to nurture now the policy of a peaceful settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. The absence of the Soviet Union now, as a supporter of the PLO in the way it had once been, gave hope to the idea that you could get a real settlement, that you could get a brokered settlement by the United States. Unfortunately, both sides at various points dug in their heels. Terrorist attacks occurred, so that even as the Cold War was disintegrating in Europe, remember 1989, the events of now 22 years ago as country after country fell in Eastern Europe. In the Middle East, Secretary of State Baker in June of 1990 would give a press conference where he said, when you're serious about peace, call us. It was basically an attempt to wash America's hands of it for a time. And Baker's frustration with both the Israelis and the Palestinians, the sense that nothing seemed to be able to be accomplished, was palpable in the news conference he gave and talking about this. Of course, the deadlock personified by Shamir and Arafat. Of course, less than a month later, Iraq invades Kuwait. The United States washes its hands essentially of the Middle East, and then suddenly the Middle East is back. Saddam Hussein's decision to invade Kuwait, we will eventually have a much more thorough, we have the documents captured from Iraq, and just about less than a month ago, the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington put on a conference talking about the translated materials we have now about Sadat's decision-making, or Saddam Hussein's decision-making. And what one learns from this in part is Saddam's determination to be the next Nasser, to be the leader of the Arab world as it was dealing with the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from a serious position and to establish Iraq as the foremost country in the region. And his decision to invade Kuwait, to secure its oil resources, to secure a territory that Iraqis had believed was its 19th province, I think 19th province, the idea being that Iraq deserved this stature. It's important to remember that Saddam earlier in the year had already begun to show sort of certain characteristics of his megalomania. In March, he had arrested a British journalist and very quickly had him tried and executed. He made statements about raining down fire on Israel. His determination to be this Nasser-like figure, finally bringing about the invasion of Kuwait. The United States launches, of course, its huge military deployment, Operation Desert Shield. It brings the United States directly into Saudi Arabia, into the defense of the Saudi territory. It also becomes later one of the key grievances of Osama bin Laden, that the kingdom had invited the infidels in to defend it. Bush successfully steers a large multilateral coalition, obtaining United Nations approval in the end for a military operation to expel Iraq from Kuwait. It is, in many respects, one of the most successful cases of alliance diplomacy in American history. It does come with a cost, namely Saddam will stay in power. I don't know if any of you remember this particular image, but Saddam, shortly after the invasion, met with many of the foreigners who were not able to leave Iraq. And I think here he was trying to show what an avuncular and happy character he was. It did, of course, the exact opposite. And Saddam's image, particularly during this time, was such that he could be conflated with Hitler by many in terms of his power-mad characteristics. The war is a great success militarily. It does lead, of course, to this famous image of the highway of death as the Iraqis were trying to withdraw from Kuwait. Bush ends the war after 100 hours with the idea that the United States didn't need to do more. It probably allowed a number of Saddam's elite military units to escape. The United States, in effect, calls for the overthrow of Saddam by the Iraqis, but basically leaves both the Shias in the south and the Kurds in the north to Saddam's devices. Eventually, the United States decides to set up no-fly zones over northern and southern Iraq. And over the 13 years between, Operation Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom, the United States would basically be conducting military operations over Iraq. They would be low profile. Then again, people like my friend Sam's son would be flying in them as the United States would be patrolling the no-fly zones and trying to prevent Saddam's armies from enacting more revenge on the Kurds and the Shia. This led to a situation in the 1990s in which the United States had a two-pronged approach to the Middle East. On the one hand, it was attempting to contain both Iraq and Iran, what was called sort of dual containment. On the other hand, it also led to the very strong prominence of a new peace process. Oslo would be the successor to Camp David, launched at first by the Bush administration in the aftermath of Desert Storm at Madrid, and then with the election of Rabin in June of 1992, and the breakthroughs in Oslo in August and September of 1993 in this famous handshake in front of Bill Clinton at that time as a sort of announcing the beginning again of a new peace process. Only a year later, the second peace treaty between an Arab state and Israel would be reached between King Hussein and Rabin. Again, the 90s saw this period of optimism about peace, again, a renewal of what we saw earlier in the 70s, the sense that this could be brought about. As I mentioned, people beginning to feel like they were seeing, and I hate to use the term, but the light at the end of the tunnel was certainly there. Well, it didn't last. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by Jewish radicals in November of 1995. Political assassination, we sometimes like to think, can't stop real progress in history, that people will unite afterwards and try to continue in the manner in which the leaders sought. Historians are more cynical. Assassination can actually work. You assassinate the right people, you can derail a peace process. And Rabin's assassination, along with other terrorist attacks on both sides during this time by radicals and extremists on both sides, undermine Clinton's and American attempts at peacemaking during the 1990s. At the very end of Clinton's administration, as would be the case with Condoleezza Rice and Bush at the end of the Bush administration in 2008, there are serious attempts at trying to get some sort of settlement. At the end of the Clinton administration comes Camp David II. And you see in this from Dennis Ross, this map from Dennis Ross's book, a map of some of the proposed borders and guidelines of the West Bank state that was thought to be a possibility at this time. I'll confess to you now, I went back to look at some of the readings, and I still don't have a strong sense of whether one can blame one side or the other from walking away from Camp David. I know that President Clinton, in his memoirs and in other talks, always blamed Arafat, was convinced that Arafat was ultimately responsible for walking away from the agreement that he had. There are arguments on the other side, arguments about some of the details of exactly what Israeli concessions were about. But in any respect, Clinton had run out of political time to get the agreement. And in fact, politics in both countries were coming apart. In September of 2000, in part as a response to the visit by Ariel Sharon to an Islamic holy site, a provocation, the Second Intifada is launched and begins. And you see violence erupting. You see a whole series of suicide bombings along with Israeli counterattacks into the West Bank. Many strikes into the cities, ultimately leading Israel to building, of course, the wall that it built ultimately during this time. In the midst of this, of course, comes September 11th for us. You might recall that the Bush administration, when it comes into power, basically does the same thing as the first Bush administration did. It says no more Middle East peace. President Clinton had Yasser Arafat to the White House more than any other visitor. George Bush II, or George W., despised Arafat, saw him as a liar, and refused to go in the sort of path of Middle Eastern peace negotiations. The result, though, was that the United States found itself after September 11th in the midst of a situation which called it back into the Middle East. The decision to go into Iraq came about in part, I think, well, came about for a variety of reasons. Part of it is psychology, part of it the vulnerability that had been exposed by September 11th. Part of it was the ideological belief of some in the White House that this could be a game changer in the Middle East. We'll be sorting out the reasons behind the invasion of Iraq for years. The hope was, I think the hope was that in part, in an American military action in the Middle East, to so change the situation on the ground as to open up the possibilities for peacemaking and other sort of answers in the Middle East. That, of course, was frustrated considerably by the events that followed. The American deal in the Middle East of having supported autocrats, having made arrangements with strong rulers in the region to secure its interests, has now almost completely come apart with the Arab Spring. On some level, Americans should welcome this. The democratization of the Middle East finally removes an irritant that many thought was a key behind even the terrorist attacks of September 11th. But, and I'll close on this point and then we can have some questions, it's going to make America's future in the region much more problematic. As countries come to be more popularly responsive, as leaders come to be more popularly responsive to their constituents, the question of making peace with Israel will be much more difficult for a time. There is some hope. The building up of some of the institutions of a Palestinian state in the West Bank under Saim Fayyad has shown some successes. Growth rates, stability in that region, shown some possibilities. But it's going to be a long haul, if nothing else. The United States is faced with a situation in which the Middle East will continue to be a key source of security concern. Even though, in many respects, as some of you may have seen in the morning's paper, the President would like us to focus on Asia. We will redeploy Marines to Australia. We will think now about the Asia as the future. Something tells me we won't get out of the Middle East. We will be back there, and even if the President gets a second term or even if he's replaced, whoever is going to be in office is going to continue to have to deal with the dilemmas created by this history. So I'll stop there and take questions. We have plenty of time. Yes? Yeah.
Would you address the question of the settlements?
Okay. Oh, yeah, the question is the settlements. Israel clearly, after the '67 war, and then into the '70s, especially with the election of Begin and those in Israel who believed in a greater Israel, pursued vigorously the setting up of settlements in the occupied territories. This was coupled with, of course, the end of the Cold War by a huge increase in immigration and more people coming to Israel. That pursuit of the settlement policy, which American administrations opposed technically, but in many respects also winked at, recognizing that the '67 borders would never be completely restored, and so not certain as to which settlements to oppose or which to allow, meant that you created also a huge political constituency in Israel, in a political system very responsive to minority concerns. And that has frequently been a stumbling block for the creation of coalitions in Israel that might carry out more far-reaching Palestinian or agreements with the Palestinians. It undermined almost every labor prime minister in Israel attempt to forge a government, even undermining figures like Barak in the Camp David Accords. So the political constituency of the settlements has now added a new roadblock to any sort of final agreement. In the end, though, Israel did conduct, in the case of Gaza, a withdrawal from settlements, a very painful one, which required the Israeli army to forcibly remove settlers. And it was done. The result was not peace, and instead you had continuing attacks from Gaza. So the settlement issue, as intense as it sometimes seemed, does not seem to me to be the overwhelming problem. The problem is in part the inability, ultimately, of a Palestinian authority to truly govern and control the extremists in its own midst. Now, granted, there are plenty of Israeli extremists. They assassinated Rabin. But I think in the end, the inability to rein in those among the Palestinians who still do not accept any existence of Israel still creates the greatest barrier to settlement, to peace. Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
You may have covered this already,
Oh.
but I didn't hear it in the last couple of sessions. This is all history. I'd
Right.
like to hear what the thoughts or speculations are about different events that may or may not happen in Iran, in Syria, in Egypt. That's what it came for.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, I have a favorite quotation that I got from a story about the hazards of pundits who predict. And it was about, it was featured on the web, and you can find it. But basically, the conclusion drawn by someone who studied pundit predictions, made by people like me who get on a newscast and say it, was that basically a dart-throwing chimpanzee would have a better chance at success. That basically people, if you actually go back and look at the types of predictions people make and the rest, you really do see a very high propensity for error. So as a good historian, I always used to duck it, and I try to. You're right, though, to ask me. I mean, after all, we're talking about the Middle East. I do see, I mean, there's critical issues coming up. The Iranian nuclear program has clearly reached a threshold. The United States has gone out of its way to say it won't accept it. What does it do? My own guess, I'm sorry, am I losing the mic? Okay. My own guess is that this will ultimately be an Israeli strike, not an American one, and that Israel will carry it out at some point that it sees as sort of convenient, probably at a point in the American electoral cycle that will make it impossible for the president to be outraged. And in fact, he won't be. I mean, there'll be a very muted reaction to any sort of strike. So that's one. Syria, I would have been much more pessimistic yesterday about what was happening there. Well, pessimistic is the wrong way of putting it. I would have been more certain that the Assad regime seemed to be able to be establishing its control. But events of the last few days have begun to change my feeling that the Arab League's criticism and kicking and booting Syria out, the fact that it's now the case that Syrian army deserters are now actually taking up arms against the Syrian regime, I think we may be seeing a civil war in Syria. We may see a very violent situation in Syria paralleling what we saw in Lebanon, which I unfortunately did not get into much here, the civil war in Lebanon that went on in the 1980s. We may see that in Syria. Other predictions, I think Israel or Egypt will remain a militarily dominated government, except that this time, rather than the military being opposed to the Islamic Brotherhood, it will cooperate with the Islamic Brotherhood. It will share power with leaders elected who express a devotion to Islam within certain limits, as long as they don't violate military privileges and the privileges of the army in Egypt. So Egypt will remain a very flawed democratic system, I think, for the time being. Israel's situation, I think Israel is in for the long haul, is probably not going to negotiate much. There's not going to be much in terms of a negotiation. The great hope is that there is slow development in the West Bank, which will make for a more stable and politically popular regime in that territory. Yeah?
So if in fact Israel does take military action, what you possibly posit would be fallout from that?
Fallout's a good question, right? The question of if Israel takes action in Iran, what would be the fallout? I think undoubtedly the Iranian regime will try to strike in different manner through its proxies in Hezbollah, its proxies in Hamas. It will try to cause more problems for the United States in parts of the world. But I don't think the consequences will be as severe as they are posited. I know that's controversial, or at least I certainly could be very wrong, and I acknowledge that. I think if they take the type of action I think they may take, they will be gambling that even though there'll be an Iranian nationalist outburst at first, that the net result will be to slow down the nuclear program enough so that in combination with some of the sabotage and other things going on, Iran will not be able to get a nuclear weapon in as quickly a time, and that the hope might be that you'll get a change in regime. Yes? Yeah.
I have a question about the Arab League. I've never, frankly, paid so much close attention to this particular area of the world, but it seems to me that Obama has been pretty successfully using the Arab League in a way that has not been used before by American presidents, certainly with respect to Libya and now with respect to Syria. I think that's a very good thing for lots of reasons. And I guess my question is, would you see it the same way, but is it also perhaps a new approach to the whole Middle East question that could come out of this?
I think in terms of the approach of the administration, using a multilateral organization fits very nicely into the attempt to move away from the image of the United States as a unilateral, unpoliced power. It's an important part of, I think, what the Obama administration, and even, I would argue, Condoleezza Rice in the second Bush administration had some of the same views. I think there was a sort of sense that they had gone too far in the first term, and that if you actually look at her memoirs, she's very much talking multilateralism, and so I do think this was part of an approach. I think what it recognized is that the American people felt very uncomfortable going in alone or doing things unilaterally. They wanted, if they were going to be brought into doing things, they wanted the sense that other powers were a part of it, agreed with it, either the United Nations, something like the Arab League, NATO. They wanted that sanction. Whether the Arab League stands up and is a prominent, I just don't know. My own sense is that, you know, its action against Syria is very interesting, because Syria used to be such a prominent member of the Arab League, and in fact was actually at one point a chair recently. But I think there is this sense that you can't keep killing your own people anymore. The age of the autocrat ruler who could act without any constraint is over. And so they're basically, it's a sort of message that we get it. We in the Arab world no longer want to be seen as the last vestige of dictatorship and autocracy. We want to be seen as held accountable by our people. And so in that sense, you know, even though I'm skeptical about how deeply rooted this change is, it does strike me as having real beneficial effect if it reflects a sense of being responsive to a sort of the broader image in the region. And remember, the Syrian issues, while not being terribly well covered in the United States, are on Al Jazeera network. I mean, people see them in the region. They see the brutality of the regime, and so that has had its impact. And that is, I think, in the large respect, a good thing. Yeah.
Was there any effect of the WikiLeaks cables in the Arab Spring?
That's a good question. I'd be hard-pressed. The question is whether there was any effect of the WikiLeaks cables in the Middle East. Of course, one of the ones that comes to mind right away is the Saudis telling us that we have to bomb Iran, which I think is fascinating. They were glad to say, you know, you guys do it. You know, we cut off the head of the snake and all of that sort of stuff. Some of the WikiLeaks cables, the sort of contempt for Libya, Gaddafi, the sort of mockery of him by some that was revealed. I wonder whether that filtered out in any way. It'd be interesting to know in retrospect whether whether these had any impact in greater public opinion. I kind of doubt it, but they've been revealing of what. And let me put it this way: they did underline something in relation to the question I was just asked by Mary about the Arab League, they underline the fact that rulers of the Middle East spoke one way in public and one way in private. And in a way, they underline something that many in the Middle East, many citizens, the growing middle class in that region really despised that sort of treatment by their rulers. And that may be a sort of, it might be a bit tangential, but that may be a symbolic aspect of their impact. Yes?
Why do we worry about Iran getting a weak nuclear weapon when Israel has about 200, and we have a very unstable Pakistan with over 100?
Good question. The central point I'd say is that there is no confidence that the Iranian regime, as it exists, or at least there is a lack of confidence in its willingness to be deterred by rational considerations. Israel, we believe, is a rational state. It would use nuclear weapons if its existence were threatened, but it would not use them otherwise.
You don't pick a fight at 200 to 1 off.
Right. You don't. The Iranians, on the other hand, if you believe that the Iranian regime still has echoes of the religious and apocalyptic elements of Shia Shia Islam, that you have people there who believe that the elimination of Israel will in some sense be a good thing, even if it takes down many of their own citizens. And, you know, suicide bombing, the willingness to destroy themselves as well as others is an unfortunate aspect of the Middle East. Well, that may be. I'm just saying from an Israeli point of view and from an American point of view, a nuclear weapon in the hands of people who might share that has a danger. And that is it. It can be argued. And certainly there is the argument that deterrence should be used, other methods should be used, that Iran is not a real danger, that once it gets a weapon. Some of you might recall that in the 60s we worried about China getting nuclear weapons because they seemed crazy.
Kane still is.
What's that? Yeah, well, that's right. Well, but I forgot. Yes, Herman did sort of indicate whether he knew that or not. But China, when it got nuclear weapons, we were worried about it. It turned out to actually have a sobering effect in some way on the leadership. But that may not be the problem. The problem is if you're an Israeli and you hear a regime talk about the destruction of Israel, and you know the Holocaust, and you know what has happened, you're going to look at it differently than we might. And I mean, that simply is the fact, and that's what American leaders have to deal with if they want to cope with it. Yeah.
How about the difference being that Pakistan does not have oil and Iran does?
But how would that really, I mean, in many respects, I think we could live with an Iranian nuclear weapon if it was not connected to that regime. The thing about Pakistan's nuclear weapons is our own belief that they are, of course, principally designed to deter India. We see them as engaged in that struggle. We don't see the Pakistani leadership as engaged in a Sunni bomb. We don't see them as having an apocalyptic mission to use or to distribute the weapons in some way to promote the interests of Sunni Islam. We may be wrong. I mean, you know, this is a huge issue of concern, and it's one of the reasons why the United States has been willing to put up with a great deal of behavior from Pakistan with other countries that would have led to a sort of end of diplomatic relations and the rest. I mean, the Pakistani nuclear program and its existence has been a factor in the appeasement of Pakistan on many other questions. And whether it should continue to be so, I know that that's an issue that's out there. This president, for example, was much more willing to go against the Pakistanis, as he did to get bin Laden, than Bush was. I mean, and Bush calculated it differently, and be interesting to see if that changes. I think we may be near it. One more question, sir. Okay.
How mutable are the national borders in the Mideast?
Nobody, how mutable, how changeable are the national borders in the Middle East? The interesting thing about borders is once they're set, even if they were drawn by drunken colonial officials, they seem to have a permanence there. if you think about it for a time, even in Africa where the borders were completely ridiculous, they've stayed, except just recently in the case of South Sudan, they've been there. So my guess, and to go to the idea of giving predictions, my guess is you're not going to see a lot of changes on borders. The real issue of borders will be, of course, the West Bank and Gaza and how that'll be arranged or carried out. But the larger question of whether other borders like Iraq, I mean, some of you may remember that our vice president at one point was talking about chopping up Iraq into 3 spots. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. And so borders, in that sense, I don't think it's likely to see great changes. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.